wanted to just do sort of a general run through of a few chapters that are kind of a turning point. They're not really a turning point, but they are, in a sense. I know that may not mean much in English there, but I think it is one of those, when you're reading Genesis, it's important. Moses has a very specific point that he's trying to make. I'm afraid most of the time when we read the narrative, either we read it with the perspective that we've had in the past, or the stories that we've grown up hearing, and we actually miss what it is that Moses is trying to explain to us. Why is that important? It's important because when New Testament writers are quoting Genesis, they actually have Moses' perspective that Moses had. And so when we're reading that, in particular, if we don't get that, we also miss the point that the New Testament writer is saying. A good example is in Romans chapter 8, I think it's verse 28, when Paul says, all things work out for good for those that are in Christ. And I'm summarizing that verse. Well, he actually has in mind one of the stories that we're actually going to look at here, because the perspective that he has when he's writing this, he's actually looking back to, this is how God works. This is how it's going to work. So that's important in terms of our evangelism, in terms of everything else that we do, because if we don't have that, we could be working hard, but for the wrong reasons, or we actually might not be pleasing to God. So it is very important. Genesis is one of the fundamental books that we really have to understand. Of course, we have to understand Exodus. We have to understand, if nothing else, study Deuteronomy. It will sort of give you the overview of the previous other books. But Moses is a very specific point that he's making, and we want to get that point in order to understand exactly what is going on. The structure of the book itself is important. Now, I want to look at Genesis 41 through probably 46. In fact, we may touch on even Genesis 50 at the end, because the same point is being made, or actually it's reiterated towards the end by Joseph. But we're introduced to Joseph in chapter 37. And it's important for us to kind of look at that. And I'll summarize for you, because I want to start looking at Genesis chapter 41, beginning in verse 37, going down. But I want to summarize it to kind of bring you up to speed, getting up to this point. We're introduced obviously in chapter 37. And in chapter 38, it's sort of, this chapter is just dropped there. It doesn't quite fit, because we're introduced to Joseph. We're talking to Joseph. All of a sudden, we're talking to Judah and Tamar. And it seems to be out of place, but it's not really out of place. Moses is going to make a point. He has a reason why he's doing that. But it's like this story that gets dropped in that says, wait a minute, are we talking about Joseph? Then all of a sudden, we're talking about Judah and Tamar. Then suddenly, in 39, we're back to Joseph. So it's like, what is that story doing there? Right? All of that matter in the writer. In order for us to really have a clear picture of the way that Moses is writing, there are probably two ways you can divide Genesis. One is there's always these elements that kept repeated, land, seed, that pop up all the time, right? We have the promised seed in Genesis chapter 3, and so that there's a trend that sort of continues. But the much more easier way, and the New Testament gospel writers use this, is through the Toledots, the generations. There are about 11 of them. I believe the one that's repeated is Esau's. That's why we have 11. So there are about 11 of them. And these, beginning with the Toledot of the heavens and the earth, these are the generations of the heavens and the earth. So every time in your English Bible, Toledot is the Hebrew word for generations. You hear the generations, of Esau. Here are the generations of so and so. Those are the divisions of Genesis that can really help you if you don't ignore them. Very often we read them, they're kind of boring. They look like it's just a genealogy. You run through something with Matthew. Well, when Matthew's doing that, they're actually making a point. They're actually going back to say, if you already understand Genesis and you're looking at this, then you should know that Jesus is the promised seed. And here's how you know. Here is the genealogy about all these preceding events that happened. But Moses uses in Genesis, that's how the book is kind of divided. So very often when we talk about the story of Joseph, we're talking about Joseph as, oh, this is the story of Joseph. But in truth, it's actually not the story of Joseph. Joseph is not the main character in the story that you see in Genesis 37 all the way to 41. And Joseph himself is actually going to tell, in case you don't believe that, Joseph himself is actually going to tell you. So what we have is, here are the generations of Noah. Here are the generations, I think it's Shem, but you don't have one for Abraham. You have his father, Terah, and then here are the generations of Esau, of Isaac. Well, Isaac has two sons. Which one is it going to be? Is it going to be Esau or is it going to be Jacob? It ends up being Jacob. So that's the last one. The story of Joseph falls within that Toledot. So Joseph's story, as we normally call it, is not Joseph's story. It's actually Jacob's story, and how Jacob is going to become a nation, actually to fulfill one of the promises that God had actually told Abraham, that your children will go into a foreign land. So in these particular chapters, there is that transition where, first of all, where we see now the descendants of Jacob, the descendants of Israel, going to Egypt. That's where they're going to multiply. So that first promise about them being multiplying like the stars, or the sands of the sea or so, actually happens in Egypt. Then you have that other two promises, one getting to the promised land and the promised seed that will come. So it's very significant that we understand that. So when we talk about Joseph's story and we're talking about, oh, this is Joseph's story, no, it's not Joseph's story. He's just a player within Jacob's story. How it unfolds is actually significant. I mean, it's evident in other words, but if not, we're actually going to hear from Joseph himself, explaining that very point. So within these stories, and I'll give you a quick summary, and then we'll then go into the story of how we arrive here in chapter 41. But there are three things that, if nothing else, when you read this, and I kind of want you to read this with fresh eyes. I don't know if voice will allow me to read through, but we're not going to read the entire thing. I'll probably jump around between verse 41 all the way to 50. But within these chapters, there are probably three main things that you should come away with and you should really understand when you're reading these. In fact, when you're reading the Bible, one is the providence of God in this story. The second one is faith, and more specifically, Joseph's faith, which is why the Hebrew writer points to Joseph as one of the heroes of faith, is precisely because of this. And the third thing that you have in this particular chapter is forgiveness, how that plays out and how we look at forgiveness, and how we look at forgiveness first from the standpoint of you letting go and freeing yourself from the burden of someone that you need to forgive, one, and number two, being able to forgive someone else and understanding why you're doing it. Those are three things that are very critical within these chapters here. So a short summary of where we are now. In chapter 37, we're introduced to Joseph. Joseph is the son of the wife whom Jacob loves. And Jacob is a terrible father. He's not shy about it. This is the woman that I loved, and these are my two children from the woman that I loved. I'm going to be obvious that I love these boys more than I love all my other children, because they are the children of the woman that I love. And from that perspective, he gets this beautiful quote. His brothers don't like him. But here's what's important that we get from that is this family knows better about how God communicates to them. How do we know that? We know that because God has been communicating to their father, to Jacob, all his life. That God is communicating him through dreams. God communicates to this family through one brother, Joseph, in dreams. His father sort of ignores it. And I think the narrative says that he just kept these things to himself. But he knows it. And he says, shall I and your brothers bow down to you? And he sort of just ignores that instead of inquiring to say, hey, God is communicating to us. Let's listen. So they kind of just ignore it. His brothers, on the other hand, they already hate him because he's the loved son. They want to kill him. Keep that in mind when we go through and read in chapter 41. They laugh at him and say, we are going to bow down to you? So in chapter 37, they sell him into slavery to Egypt. He gets to Egypt, he is sold in the slave market, and he's bought by Potiphar. So he goes and works in Potiphar's home. And that is in chapter 38. There is this question now that we have to answer. Chapter 39, sorry. What's chapter 38 doing there? Because chapter 38, we've got Judah, he's lost his wife, he's got his boys, one of them is married, and he's evil. God kills him. And then Judah says to the younger brother, go perform your duty so you can raise up a family for your brother. He doesn't want to do it, spills his seed, God kills him. There's one child left. Any father, if you lost two boys to the same woman, you might think twice about giving the third. Judah does the same thing. He's hesitant. He told this woman, go stay in your father's house until my younger son is older. He doesn't do it. The son has gotten older. He hasn't been given to him. She decides to trick him. He's gone out drinking. He's gone somewhere. It's not drinking. I've heard people repeat that, but I don't think this text says that. He's gone out someplace and he's on his way back. And she dresses like a temple prostitute. And he wants to go into her. And she says, what will you give me for this? And he goes, I'll send you a young goat. He says, what will you give me as a pledge? And she gives his signet ring and his stuff. And she takes that. Well, she gets pregnant. And towards the end of chapter 37, people have reported to Judah that she's played the harlot, she's pregnant, she's with child. And he says, bring her out so they can stone her. She sends the signet ring and stuff. She says, I'm pregnant by the man this stuff belongs to. He recognizes his signet ring and he recognizes his stuff. And he said, she is more righteous than I. It is one of the first instances that we actually see the word that Paul ends up using in Romans chapter 1. It's translated righteousness, dikaiosune in Greek, which means she is in the right than I. And Judah explains what he is saying there is not that she's right by playing the harlot, but he is saying, I had a covenant with this woman. I made her a promise that when my youngest son is older, I will give her my youngest son. I did not do that for fear that my son would die. Obviously, that's what he's saying. But in as much as, and this is exactly what in as much as I did not give her my youngest son, she's more righteous than I. And they end up not stoning her. What he means is that she is in the right as it regards to the covenant that he had with her. Now, it still doesn't explain what chapter 38 is doing until we then get to chapter 42, is it now? Yeah. Yeah, until we get, chapter 43. Until chapter 43. Until we get to about chapter 43. Is when it's actually going to make sense. Because just as a hint, Isaac had two sons. So the question was going to be, is it going to be Esau or is it going to be Jacob, the next seed? Because we know we've got to get to the seed that's promised in Genesis chapter 3. So which one is it going to be, right? Jacob now has 12 sons. Who among the 12 sons is going to be the promised seed? That's what Moses is trying to get us to. And within that is the providence of God. Now we know who is going to be, but we need to look at the text. Just follow the text and not the knowledge that you already have, because you kind of already understand that. So Joseph has been sold here in 37. In 39, he's working for Potiphar. And Potiphar's household prospers in a lot of ways. Joseph rises up, he's running the home and everything. There's a problem. Potiphar's wife wants to have sexual relations with him. And, he says, hey, my master has not denied me anything. I always found how precise Joseph was. He says, why should I sin against God? He doesn't say necessarily his master in the narrative. He does say, my master has not, denied me anything except you. I run everything. He doesn't worry about anything. I run everything. But he says, me having relations with you, someone else's wife, is me sinning against God. Now she ends up falsely accusing him, and he ends up in jail. So now he has been sold into slavery. He's worked, he has risen to run Potiphar's house. He's now been thrown in prison, and now he's languishing in prison. So while he's in prison, he meets the cupbearer, Pharaoh's cupbearer. He meets Pharaoh's chief baker. They both have dreams, and they're struggling with their dreams. And Joseph says, tell me your dreams. And he tells them their dreams, and basically pretty much just says, cupbearer, you'll be restored to your position, and you'll serve Pharaoh again. Chief baker, you are going to be killed. And the birds will feast on you, pretty much. And it happens the same way. Joseph tells the cupbearer, please remember me when you get out. He gets out, forgets about him. It's been, I think, 2 years after that. Then Pharaoh has two twin dreams. You've got these fat cows and stuff that come, 7 fat cows. And then after that, you've got 7 thin cows. The thin cows swallow the fat ones. And then he has another one with the ears. And then no one is able to interpret. It's only then that the cupbearer remembers that there is this young Hebrew man when we're in prison. When Pharaoh you were met at me, and he foretold our dreams, and it happened exactly the way that he had said things would happen. So that's the position that we're now in chapter 41, because now Pharaoh has asked Joseph. And earlier in chapter 41, Joseph prepares himself, shaves himself, prepares himself to go before the emperor. Keep in mind, this is the most powerful nation at the time. There's no other superpower. This is the most powerful nation that there is in the whole world. And so Joseph is going before Pharaoh, the most powerful man, and he prepares himself and he goes before Pharaoh. And so Pharaoh tells him his dream. And first Joseph says, it is not me. What I'm going to tell you comes from God. He doesn't take credit for this. He actually is saying, I don't have any power, but God is going to let Pharaoh know what's going to happen and what his dreams mean. So all of that is important when you look at Joseph's faith. And so he says, well, God will let Pharaoh know what's about to happen. His dreams are the same. Now, he tells Pharaoh what's going to happen. Then he gives him advice. In the 7 good years, store lots of grain, store enough to sustain the nation when the 7 bad years come. And it is better that you get someone that's going to be in charge of this project, to store all the grain that needs to be stored so that in the 7 bad years, people will not starve. God has told you what is going to happen. And the fact that these dreams have been repeated is God will make sure that it will come to pass. It's imminent. It's going to happen. Well, Pharaoh is pleased with that, and he says, this is now where we're getting to now in around verse 38. The proposal which Joseph had just proposed, and please go back and read this. Don't just take what I just sort of summarized for you, because that's not everything. Go back and read this. Yeah. And this proposal pleased Pharaoh and all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find a man like this in whom the Spirit of God? Please note, when Pharaoh says the Spirit of God, he's not talking about the God of Abraham, God of Isaac. This is a man who believes he's a God. He believes in his God. So he's not really believing in the God of Israel and the God of... so it's important that we keep that as well. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, since God has shown you all this, there is none so discerning and wise as you are. In case did you catch that? Joseph, before he interprets the dreams, gives credit to God. Pharaoh gives credit to Joseph. As you are, you shall be over my house, and all of my people shall order themselves as you command. That is not a good thing. On the surface of it, it sounds like it is really a good thing. It's not. Remember, every house that Joseph is in prospers. Whose house is Joseph supposed to be prospering? Just Jacob's house. Sons work to prosper their father's houses. He's supposed to be prospering his father's house. And here, Pharaoh says, you shall be over my house, which means Pharaoh's house is going to prosper, and my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards to the throne will I be greater than you. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set you over the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand and clothed him in a garment of fine linen and put a gold chain on his neck. There's all kinds of problems here. I have set you over all the land of Egypt. Remember, when you read later, Egypt is going to be the land where Israel is told never to return. It's antagonistic to everything that God wants to do. That's not the land that you want to go to. In fact, so much that even in the New Testament, when we sin, it's a return to Egypt. There is the promised land where they're supposed to be. Joseph is supposed to be in Canaan. So it's not a good thing here that he's now put in charge, and if you will, he's sort of the prime minister of Egypt. It's not a good thing in the way that we normally look at it and say, oh, look here how things have happened. Joseph has been a slave, he's struggled, he's this, and all of a sudden he is this prime minister in the most powerful nation. That's not the message that Moses is trying to relay to us. These are all things that are actually not good, that should not be happening. Joseph should be in the promised land. He should be over his father's house, and his father's house should be prospering because of Joseph. But now he's over Pharaoh. Instead of wearing the coat of many colors from his father, he's being given fine linen and everything by Pharaoh. Let's read on, in case there are some that may not be convinced here. And he made him ride in a second chariot, and they called out before him, bow the knee. Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Remember his brothers? Joseph said, in my dream, you guys are bowing before me, and they want to kill him. Pharaoh says to the Egyptians, bow the knee, and they gladly do it. So the people that are supposed to know that God communicates through the dreams and understand all this don't, or they don't want to hear it. But the pagans are told by Pharaoh to say, bow the knee, and they said, oh yeah, sure. And they bow the knee to Joseph. I am Pharaoh. Without your consent, no one shall lift up their hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zephanath Paneah, and gave him in marriage to Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, the priest of On. Did you see the problem there? Pharaoh doesn't really believe. He is now giving Joseph a wife from a priest of Egyptian gods. So he's not believing in the God of Israel, the God of Jacob, the God of Abraham. So key problems here. We don't like it when we look at Daniel and his friends when they're given different names when they're enslaved in Babylon. In fact, we almost never use those names. We don't think it's a good thing. But somehow or another, we have not had problems. Most of the time this story is taught, we don't have problems with this. That here is a young man who's a Hebrew, and he's given an Egyptian name. So notice the sequence of events. He is now over Pharaoh's house. He was over Potiphar's house. He's now over Pharaoh's house. He's now over all the land of Egypt. And by the way, he's supposed to be over his father's house. He's supposed to be wearing the coat that his father has given him. He's supposed to be in the land of Canaan. He's in a foreign land where he's not supposed to be. None of that. Moses doesn't tend to make any of that a good thing about what's supposed to be happening. That's the message we're supposed to be getting out of this. So it's not intended to be, this is such a great story of, if you're just faithful, if you just do this, then God will just bless you. That's not it. Because it actually distorts what we understand about the providence of God. And we'll talk a little bit about that shortly here. So now he's been given an Egyptian name. And Joseph was 30 years old when he entered service into Pharaoh's kingdom. Now, he begins his work. He's collecting grain. He's doing all this. And then we get down to verse 50 or 41. Before the year famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. In case now we're going to hear from Joseph, right? Because in case you don't believe what we just ran through, Joseph himself is going to tell us how he's understanding everything that's happened to him and what's going on here. 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh. For he said, God has made me forget the hardships and all of my father's house. You may give me a different name. You may give me a pagan wife. But I'm going to give my children Hebrew names. Manasseh. I've forgotten everything that happened to me in my father's house. I will not be burdened by everything that my brothers did to me in my father's house. I'm going to free myself. And my firstborn, I'm going to call him Manasseh. Because I've forgotten all the hardships in my father's house. That's forgiveness as it relates to yourself. And then he had another son, and he named that son Ephraim. For God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Oh, wait a minute. There's only one man above you, Pharaoh. You run everything. This is the most powerful nation. And that is the land of your affliction? It's kind of hard for most people to understand, unless if you're an immigrant This is the most powerful nation, and you're successful. You've risen all this, you're this, but that's the land of your affliction. Saints, that's the same for us. You're citizens of heaven, and you're here to bring the civilization of heaven. It doesn't matter how successful you become, it's always going to be the land of your affliction. Egypt is the land of my affliction. I'm the prime minister of Egypt. I don't have to worry about food. I don't have to worry about everything. But I'm giving myself, my son, a Hebrew name because this is the land of my affliction. So now it's been 2 years. And you're now in the second phase. You now have a famine, and it's been 2 years, and his brothers come to Egypt to buy grain. Joseph is in charge. He has stored up grain, and remember I said one of the things that keep coming, elements kept coming as seed, is when you read that, Moses sort of used the same analogy that he used when God is telling Abraham that your descendants are going to be, as sand of the sea. He sort of used that in how much grain Joseph has collected. So he has piled up lots and lots of grain. And this is where everyone, the entire world, can go to get food. You go to Egypt. Jacob says, hey, look, boys, I hear they've got lots of grain in Egypt. Why don't you go to Egypt and get us some grain? So the boys go. And Joseph recognizes his brothers, and he tests them. So he gives them grain, but then he gives them back their money. He questions them, he's questioning them, and they're telling them, yeah, we've got another brothers, and one brother is dead. And Joseph says, you don't come back unless if you bring your other brother. So they go back, they eat, and they run out of food. The boy Jacob says, hey, why don't you go get some grain? They go, no, we can't go back, for the man was, hard on us. He said, don't come back unless you can bring your other brother, Benjamin, Joseph's brother. These boys know how hard it is. Jacob has been grief-stricken ever since Joseph. He has not really recovered. He's a terrible father. He's not really recovered. Now they're proposing that they want to take Benjamin also. He says, no. And down in verse 37 of chapter 42, then Reuben said to his father, and this is important for you to keep track because you contrast this with what Judah says later on. Reuben said, kill my 2 sons if I do not bring him back, referring to Benjamin, bring back to you. Put him in my hands and I will bring him back. But he said, my son, Jacob, this is Jacob, my son shall not go down with you, for his brother is dead, for he's the only one left. If harm should happen to him on this journey that you are to make, you would bring down my gray hair with sorrow to Sheol. So Reuben says, you know what, Dad, we can go back. Give me your boy, I'll go. If I don't bring him back, you could kill your grandsons. I'm not sure that I would have trusted that man. And obviously, Jacob does not. So they refuse to go. They're not going to go unless Benjamin goes with them. But then now listen and contrast what Judah says. This is why this is important when you look at chapter 38, why it looks like it's out of place, but it's really not. In verse 8, and Judah said to Israel, his father, send the boy with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die. But we and you and also our little ones. I will be a pledge for his safety. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. Does that sound familiar? Because it should. Here is the son that my father loves. I am asking my father to say, entrust the son that you love and I will bring him back. I am going to be a pledge that no harm will come to him. I will make sure that I bring him safely to you. So much that I am willing to sacrifice myself in order to bring back the son whom my father loves. Judah is the fourth son. He's not supposed to be the leader of the household. From this chapter is where we really know that Judah is the next seed in line. And Moses is actually going to confirm that in chapter 44. In chapter 44, in verse 14, he says, when Judah and his brothers came to Joseph's house, it should not have been Judah. That was always the privilege of the oldest son. Judah is now the head of the household. He's now the leader among his brothers. And he's not supposed to. He's the fourth son. If it wasn't him, it would have been the second, it would have been the third. He's fourth. That's who God has chosen. That he's going to be the next seed. That story, I said it should sound familiar to you. It is, because Judah is going to have a greater son. Don't go too far. Who is going to stand between a man who's challenging the nation of Israel, Goliath. David goes and says, who is this man here who defies the God of Israel? And whoever it is, Goliath has challenged them. You bring your best men to fight me. If I win, you serve us. If you win, we serve you. Joseph goes and stands between the rest for the nation of Israel and this man who's challenging God's people. And he fights and he wins a battle for God on behalf of all the nation of Israel. And David is going to have a greater son who is going to stand before us and say, I am here to sacrifice myself on behalf of the children whom my father loves, the people that God created in his own image. And I'm willing to die for them, for the sins I did not commit, but so that I can put them in the right. And that's what Paul has in mind when he says, for in the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written that the righteous shall live by faith. That's important for us to understand how the rest of the narrative is unfolding. So, the providence of God. What Joseph understood about because he has spent a lot of time in jail, some 13 years or so in total. But he understands why he's there. These boys come back. And Joseph plays games with him. Puts his cup in Benjamin's cup, and they're brought back to his house. And they are just distraught. And he can hear them because he understands. Because they have never been free of their sin because they think they killed their brother. And he can hear them telling each other that, it's come back to haunt us. We killed our brother. We should not have killed our brother. And Joseph can hear them, and he can help himself finally. And finally, he reveals himself in chapter 45. Actually, let me back up for a second in chapter 44, because this is important, with regard to what Joseph, what we heard what Judah say to his father. Is he going to do it when he's called upon it? So now Joseph is testing them, and he puts his cup in Benjamin's sack. And Joseph says, I'm going to keep him. Judah goes before Joseph. He doesn't know, right, that this is his brother. And in verse 18 of chapter 44, and Judah went up to him and said, "Oh, my Lord, please let your servant speak a word in my Lord's ear, and let not your anger burn against your servant, for you are like Pharaoh himself. My Lord asked his servant, saying, Have you a father or a brother? Have you a father or a brother? And we said to my Lord, we have a father, an old man, excuse me, and a younger brother, the child of his old age. His brother is dead, and he alone is left of his mother's children, and his father loves him." So he loved Joseph, and Joseph is gone. Now he loves Benjamin, the other son from the woman that he loves. He doesn't care too much about the other ones, which is ironic when we talk about the providence of God. And it's sort of just a little titty bit of information that Moses throws out there, and you say, huh? When Jacob is about to die, he is going to make his children promise. In fact, Joseph promised that you won't bury me in Egypt. You're going to take me back and bury me in the land of Canaan, and you're going to bury me in the land that Abraham purchased. And he'd start telling about who's buried there. He loves Leah. He loves Rachel. But in the cave, who's buried? Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah. And he says, and there I buried Leah. Rachel is kind of buried on a roadside as they're going through. We'll find out that that land ends up being inherited by Joseph's descendants. But she's kind of buried out there, which is very ironic. The woman who's not loved is the woman that ends up in the genealogy of Christ, is the woman that is buried with all the other patriarchs in this. Abraham is buried there, Sarah is buried there, Isaac is buried there, Rebekah is buried there. Jacob is going to be buried there with Leah, not with the woman that he loved. Just a little bit more information. By the way, you get that out of Genesis 49 when Jacob is about to die, and he's making his sons promise that they'll go bury him back there. So if you want to read that, you can read that a little bit later. So here, so he's explaining, but run down really quickly, and we'll probably have to stop here. Run down really quickly to verse 28. Verse 27, starting from, then your servant, my father, say to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One left me, and I said, surely he has been torn to pieces, and I'll never see him. If you take this one also, and harm happens to him, you will bring down my gray hairs in evil to Sheol. Now therefore, as soon as I come to your servant my father, and the boy is not with us, then as his life is bound up in the boy's life, as soon as he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. And your servant will bring down the gray hairs of your servant, our father, with sorrow to Sheol. For your servant became a pledge of safety for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father all my life. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back to his with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father. Keep me as your slave, because I cannot go back to my father without the son that my father loves. I will stay if you would just let the boy go with his father. This is what gets to Joseph, and suddenly he can't anymore. He's gotta just tell his brothers who he is. And in chapter 45, he says, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? He now reveals who he is to his brothers. In verse 4, he says, so Joseph said to his brothers, come near to me, please. And they came, and he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourself because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing or harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth, to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. I have suffered. I've been sold into slavery. I've been thrown into jail. You were just the instrument, but it was not you. One way or another, God was going to get me here because it was God, always God's providence. And the reason is I was sent here to preserve Judah. It's not because I am prime minister or all this. That's not the reason. But my purpose in this Toledot, in my father's house, was to make sure that I preserve the next seed, the remnant that was going to get us to Christ. I have suffered, I've gone through all this, but I understand that it was God's will. God's providence isn't when something good happens, which is most of the time we'll hear something good has happened. Oh, that was just God's providence. If I die, it is God's providence too. Because in other words, what we're suggesting that is there are times when God is sleeping and he goes, oops, I didn't realize Jacob was going to do that. That's how we make it sound, as if God is sleeping some other times when certain things happen. No, everything, whether it's good or bad, is God's providence. There is nothing that will happen to you that God could not stop, because if you say that, then you're suggesting that God is not powerful enough and that there's some other power that's more powerful than God. Whether I live or die, it is God's providence. I may not fully understand it. Joseph understood why. He also understood. He knew his brother sold him to slavery, but he's telling them, God sent me here. And in fact, he's going to be much more clearer if you go to chapter 50. Because these boys, they think he's not revenging them because of their father. And as soon as their father dies, they're worried. They think Joseph is going to revenge. And notice what he says there in chapter 50. By the way, they lie too. They say, well, Dad said, please forgive your brothers, because they're afraid. You can read it. I'm sort of summarizing this, but you can read this at the end of chapter 15. But in verse 19 of chapter 50, Joseph said to them, do not fear. Am I in the place of God? It is not my place to seek revenge for what you did. As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. He is not saying these boys are innocent. He's simply saying, this is what God intended. I'm in Egypt because God sent me here, and my purpose is to preserve a remnant so that I can get to the promised seed. And you're there in chapter 50. Just to show you that I believe in the providence of God, just to show you that I have faith that God is going to do everything that he said he was going to do. And just to prove that I have forgiven what happened to me in my father's house, and I've forgiven you, I'm going to provide for you. And when I die, when God comes to take you to the promised land which he promised, because I know that God is going to do what he promised because I've seen what he has done in my life, I want you to take my bonds with you. That's the scripture that the Hebrew writer cites. When the Hebrew writer says, Joseph gave instructions concerning his bonds. There are about 4 verses that mention Joseph's bonds. The first one is here in chapter 50. The second one is when Israel is leaving and Moses gives instructions to go and get Joseph's bonds, and they carry them in the wilderness. And when they finally get into the promised land, that's the third time that is mentioned that they buried Moses' bonds. So they took Joseph's bonds into the promised land. And then the last one is when the Hebrew writer points the heroes of faith. He believed it enough to say, I am a Hebrew. I may have been in this land of my affliction, but when you leave here, when God takes you from this place, you're going to take my bonds and you're going to bury me in the promised land. That's faith. Now, we ran through very quickly because we don't have time, but understand Joseph's perspective about the providence of God, that God was working through Joseph, working with Joseph to achieve what God always wanted, and Joseph knew it. And he knew that he had to let go the fact that his brother sold him to slavery. He knew that he had to forget the hardship that he had gone through, that the imprisonment that he's gone through. He understood what God was going to do. And he knew that all things that have happened, his ability to interpret those dreams, his rise and the houses that were prospering, he knew that was all the providence of God in his life. Unless we have some such perspective and knowledge of our life to understand the providence of God in our lives, we're going to struggle. Unless if we're willing to have that faith that says God is going to do exactly what he has said, and I may not fully understand everything about my life, but as long as I'm understanding scriptures and I am working through to do the things that God commands us, that I can continue to grow strong in my faith. And most of all, that I'm able to forgive for my sake, for God's sake, and for the sake of those I forgive. So much that Joseph said, I am always going to provide for you, even though you did. And it's not my place to judge you. No, he doesn't say judge you, but he simply says that judgment, that's between you and God. God knows what you did. I'm not in the place of God. I know what this means for me. Those 3 critical points are important for us to understand. But as you read through, you see the providence of God, because it's no wonder that you have these people that are flawed that we see in the text. We have David, who is an adulterer and a murderer, but he's the man after God's heart. We have to reconcile. What does that mean? What does that mean for us? Because we are just as flawed, if not worse, than some of the things that David did in a number of ways. It also helps us to understand what faith means. The book of Romans, this is where Paul is going. This is why it's important for us to understand it, because in Romans, Paul is trying to tell us exactly what's going to be important for us to receive our salvation. Do not think that you get to heaven because you don't sin, or because you're not going to sin. There's not a day that walks by that you can say, today I did good, I didn't sin, because if you did, you just sinned because you're proud. But thanks be to God, because chapter 7 of Romans, wretched man that I am, who will save me from this body of death? Because the good that I want to do, I can't do, or I don't do, But the bad that I don't want to do, that I do. And it's a funny transition to then get from that to chapter 8. There is now no katakrima, there is now no condemnation for those that are in Christ.